Hi guys, Lucy aka The Watchbox Diaries here with another video for you. Now I've decided to take two Rolex giants and put them head to head. In one corner we have the 36mm Oyster Perpetual reference 116000 with the 369 dial. And in the other corner we have the 36mm Explorer reference 124270. Now on the surface these two look very, very similar, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details, so let's compare. Now let's start with probably the most obvious difference, and that is the dial. The Oyster Perpetual comes with a brushed sunburst blue dial. Rolex do this colourway so incredibly well. It is a beautiful colour, especially when it hits the light. Text-wise, the font is pretty small and there's not a lot of it on the dial, which is always a winner for me. The Oyster Perpetual is much simpler. It just has a black lacquered dial, so it does look pretty flat, especially compared to the Oyster Perpetual. And there is quite a lot of wording squished into the top half of the dial. You know, it's my pet hate, so I'm not a huge fan of that. Moving on to hands now. The Oyster Perpetual comes with a very classic baton style hand found on all of the OPs, and it has a very clean, very sleek second hand. The Explorer has the very iconic Mercedes hands with that gorgeous lollipop second hand. Now, they were not named this because of the car brand, no. They actually got their name from Mercedes Gleets, who in the 1920s swam the channel testing out a Rolex. I do prefer the points of the Explorer hands because it just gives a little bit more accuracy when you're reading the time. Indices wise, they're pretty much the same. The Oyster Perpetuals are a little bit stumpier and the 12 o'clock marker is actually the coronet. Whereas on the Explorer, they are a little bit longer and the 12 o'clock marker is reserved for a big lume triangle and the coronet is actually just added to the branding on the dial. Now moving from dial to bezel, the Explorer's is a much straighter, flatter chamfer. So it does appear a little bit more blocky and much more of a step between the dial and the case. The OP's, on the other hand, is a much smoother, sleeker, domed bezel. So it actually appears more of a fluid transition between the dial and the case and sort of just melts them together, which I really appreciate. Now, seeing these watches separately, you would probably think they are pretty similar in terms of case shape, but when you put them side by side, there is clearly a difference. Now the Oyster Perpetual is a little bit more of a plump case shape. It's almost cushion, and it's actually a nod to the old bobble backs, which is pretty cool. Height-wise, it sits at 11.7mm, which isn't too bad at all. The Explorer is a little bit more on the sleeker side. It's much more rounded with thinner lugs. There is an ever so slight reduction in thickness at just 11.5mm, but both the Oyster Perpetual and the Explorer sit really nicely on my 6.25-inch wrist. The Oyster Perpetual is a 20mm lug width and it tapers down to a lovely 16mm at the clasp, and the fact that it tapers from a 20 to 16 means that it is pretty well balanced between the head and the clasp, so it doesn't roll around on your wrist. The Rolex Explorer is a 19mm lug width, very odd, and it tapers down to just 14mm. Now, that to me is quite a severe taper and it does make the watch feel a little bit imbalanced personally between the watch head and the clasp. I do also think that at 19mm you're limiting the strap options. Now moving around to the clasps, the Oyster Perpetual uses the classic Oyster clasp, so no fold over, no easy links. There are 3 additional extension options, but you do need a tool to utilise this. The Explorer uses the folding Oyster lock clasp. Now, I'm not a huge fan of these kinds of clasps just because nails are not its friend. It's way too easily scratched having that additional sort of lock over the top. But I know some of you guys are much more of a fan of it as it's a bit more security. It does also come with the Easy Link extension, which again, I think a lot of you guys are going to appreciate. One of the other differences between them is that the OP has an embossed logo on the clasp, whereas the Explorer's is applied, so very different methods of branding. Movement-wise, there is quite a difference between the two. Yes, they do both have in-house automatics, but the Oyster Perpetual carries the 3130, which only has about 48 hours of power reserve, whereas the Explorer uses the 3230. Not that much different in terms of numbers, but it actually has 70 hours of power reserve. I do think that if they still made this Oyster Perpetual, whether it would have an upgraded movement, so that power reserve would be increased. Availability-wise, as I mentioned, the Oyster Perpetual has been discontinued. They discontinued it a couple of years ago, so if you want to get your hands on one, you can go to places like Chrono24 and pick them up for around about £5,000. The 36mm Explorer is still within their current catalogue, so if you can get one at retail, they will set you back £6,100. If you don't want to do the waiting though, and you don't mind paying a little bit of a markup, you can still get them on the secondary market, places like Chrono24 again, for around about £7,000. That is it. That is our comparison complete. Now, while these watches on the surface do look pretty similar, if you break it down to the nitty-gritty details, they're pretty different. In one corner, you have the perfect boring watch, which is obviously the Explorer. That's what I like to call it. It is clean, it is simple, and it's much more of a tall watch in terms of its details. On the other hand, you have the Oyster Perpetual, which is a classic design, but with a much bolder dial. To me, it is the perfect sport/dress watch hybrid, and it brings the two styles together pretty beautifully. Now I'm going to pass this judgment over to you guys. Which one is the better watch? Which one do you prefer and why? Let me know in the comments section below. There is a lot of hype over the Rolex Explorer, so I want to know, is it justified? As always, if you have enjoyed this content and you want to support the channel, make sure you've done all the YouTubey things, make sure you've liked and subscribed, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, then make sure you turn on the little bell, and YouTube will do its thing. Until next time, people, bye!